Alright, so I'm going to show you what I got going here from just the past 2 days work. And the restriction on this is that I'm working on just my laptop. So I have no access to Maya, and I have no access to Unity Pro. So what I had to do was try and build something that uses only stuff that I draw in Photoshop, which I can do now since I have CS3 installed on the laptop, and use just coding that can be done in Unity Basic. And then the thought is, if I decide that I want to move this over, if we decide that we want to move forward with this, I can put it on my desktop, which I've done now, and build it towards Android for Unity Pro, and put in anything else that we need that's only in Unity Pro and not Unity Basic. So basically what it started out as was I was messing around in Unity, checking out assets that I hadn't used before, because they just released Unity version 5.2F, and I decided I haven't messed with any of the 2D physics yet. So I went up and I made a sprite, and then I went to the components and I added some physics 2D, which was just a box collider, and I came up with this guy. And he started out as just a box. And so I went forward and I tried to see what I could do with that, because, you know, Xube started out as just a box and sort of went from there and was a huge pain in the ass. So I wanted to keep this one relatively simple. So it turns out what you can do with just a box, if you don't want to do all the pain in the ass animation that we did with Xube, you can use rigid body physics. So on this guy, I have a 2D rigid body, and I have a box collider, and then on there I put a platform character controller. And what the platform character controller does is, here it is right here, is it has a few different variables in it. You got move force, which is the force that's applied when you use A or D, or the arrow key left or right. And what that does is it multiplies it by a float H, and H is the horizontal movement inside of Unity. So H is either going to be positive if you press D, or negative if you press A, and it's always going to be 1. So essentially, if you press D, it's going to be H, which is 1 times the move force. So it's going to be 365 F, which is just floating point value, in the positive direction. If you press A, H is going to be negative, so it's going to be negative 1 times 365 floating point, and that's going to take you left. And then I also have jump here, which will add force in the upward direction. And then at the same time, I have it adding torque, so that it rotates the guy a little bit. I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I have my basic cube here, and then when I jump, it just adds force upward. And when I move left, moves me left. When I move right, moves me right. And the torque thing happens if I'm moving in a direction. I have it set to move, or to spin the character in correspondence with the direction he's moving in. So if I hold A and I press space, he spins a little bit. Or if I press D and hold space, he spins a little bit. And it kind of changes if he's on flat terrain or something like that. And you'll also notice that I have the eyes here. If he's moving left, we'll point left, and if he moves right, he moves right. So I'll show you where that is in the script. I have a variable called eyes, which is just a game object, and it updates so that the eyes follow it, so that they have the same position and that they have the same scale. And what I tried at first was just making it a child of the object. I just had the eyes be a child of the cube, and what happened was, as the cube would spin, the eyes would spin, right? So it kind of didn't have a good look to it. It looked ridiculous. So now I had a cube that could bounce around, right? So where did I want to go from there if I wanted to move forward with it? I decided he needs some sort of environment to go in. And so I built sort of a bar environment, and it looked absolutely nothing like this. I can show you, in fact. I went and I built just a very basic sort of a texture using a free image editor. Autodesk put out a free image editor online. And I used that to just build sort of a bar. And what I used for it was this guy, floor panel. Now the problem with floor panel, and you're going to think this is probably interesting because I did, is that the texture itself is blue, right? That's a great look, but say that I put in a different asset that doesn't go along with blue, I want to be able to change it. If I try and change the color in Maya, or in Unity, I can come here and I try and change it to red, it goes to black. I can try and change it to any of these colors, because it's sort of like using hue shift or using curves in Photoshop when you already have a color assigned. It's not quite as predictable. So I decided, okay, scrap that crap. I got Photoshop on there now. I'm going to build something else. So I built this guy. And a trick that I learned in Xube is that if you build your assets grayscale, you can then color them inside of Unity and save yourself a lot of a headache trying to get your colors to look right. So if I go into my project here and I look at sprites and go to shapes, all of my shapes are grayscale aside from the original cube that I had and the original floor panel. And the pupils and the eye are blue, but that's okay. So I have the ground here, the grass for it is a grayscale, and the rock and everything is all grayscale. So if I import it into the scene, I have my dirt platform is just white, which is actually just the rock. And then with that, I have the grass, which is green. And if I want to change the color of that inside the scene, I can just change it. Say I want it all to be blue, or say I want purple grass, or anything like that. And that comes from just inside Unity. I don't have to do any of the color or anything outside of it. And so the next thing that I went to do was to build sort of obstacles, because there has to be something that stops you from just being able to bounce around the scene, right? So I built sort of blocks, and they started out as just more of these orange cubes. They didn't have any sort of a look to them, and Catherine recommended something like ice, so I built sort of ice. And that was fine. I could just use a rigid body. I didn't have to use any scripting for that, so that was a piece of cake. But I wasn't getting a feel for ice. So I went through and I created a ice physical material. And this is actually pretty easy. If you want to make an ice physical material, you go to create and you go to physics 2D material, and I'll go tester. And for tester, I'll make the friction 0 and I'll make bounciness 1.5. And then I can apply that to an object. Tester. And then when I play the scene, when I hit this one, it's going to be very bouncy. See, if I hit this one, I bounce off of it. If I jump on any of the other ones, that'll bounce me off. If I jump on any of these, no, not bouncy at all, because these are still set to ice. They're just slippery. If I jump on this last one, it bounces me off. So it's pretty easy to assign your materials. And so once I had a couple of obstacles going on, I decided, what does every platformer have? It has sort of like moving panels. So I built these guys, and these guys are using something inspired by the first script that I actually got for Unity, which is called flotate. And all flotate does is it uses sine to move the object up and down. However, I want this whole project to be in C#, because as we discussed before, C# is a little bit, I can do a little bit more with it than I can with Java. So I rebuilt the script in C#, and then built another one called jitter, which does the exact same thing except for uses cosine for the x-axis. And I use flotate for these, and it can lift them up and down. And then I use jitter for, at one point I had water underneath here that would just shift back and forth. And I took it out actually just because I wasn't getting the look that I wanted. But it's still in there. So this is what the water looked underneath it. But the problem with the look that I was getting, which I haven't fixed yet because I haven't decided to spend the time on it, is see how it's all blocky here. So that's probably just something simple. I probably just set them up wrong and it would be fixed by just going to do it again. But I haven't worked on this long enough to take the time to do that. So we'll take that back out. And so the next thing that I came across that I hadn't actually done before was attaching a background image to the main camera. So if you're going to mess with Unity, this might actually be important to you. Camera layers. So you know with camera layers in Maya and with Mental Ray, you can assign a camera to render only a certain layer. What's very similar in Unity, if I have my main character, or my main camera, I have all these layers that I can render it. And I have it set to not render the background image. And then I have this background camera set to render just the background image. Now the background camera has a GUI texture applied to it, so that it's always looking at this blue sky thing here. And its render depth is behind that of the main camera. So since the main camera renders everything else, and then there's just essentially an alpha channel behind everything else, it then defers to the background camera to see what it's seeing. And it's seeing this sort of a hazy background that you're seeing in the game view. And this one, the background camera, doesn't actually move. So when the main camera moves around, it always defers to what the background camera is seeing, and it's always seeing the exact same thing. So I have this background falling around. So I could fall off the map, which I can't because I have a death zone. But if I fell off the map and just fell continuously, it would always see that background. So then I decided I liked what this was looking like, and it actually, to be honest, looks a lot prettier on my desktop than it does on the laptop. And I decided to just build a couple more assets for it. So I built this wall and this flat panel and just sort of expanded it out a little bit. And so this is as far as I've gotten with it right now. Now, the other problem that I actually just fixed yesterday was that when I was playing as this guy, and I would come up against a different object, for instance, I'll show you, I'd come up against this cube here, I could jump continuously all the way up to the top of it. I'd be up against it, I could jump continuously all the way up to the top of it. And that kind of defeats the purpose of having ledges that you can't quite make it up. So what I did for that was I used a method that we had used in Xube. Now the accepted method for detecting if the character is grounded is you use a script sort of like this one, which I have commented out. But I left it in here just to show you. So essentially what it does is it does a sort of a line cast between the transform of the character and the ground check position. And the ground check is just a game object, which I don't have a variable in here for, but imagine that it's another one of, actually I do have one right here. So it's this one right here. What it does is it checks the position of that, and if the distance is 1 or less, then it will say that the character is grounded. And this works, and this is fine, except for if you have multiple ground objects, is what I was running into. So you'll see here I've got, this is a ground object, and this is a ground object, and they're all individual, so it's a little bit modular, and then this would be a second group, and this right here wouldn't count as a ground object unless it was on, unless it had the ground tag. So I was running into, that script would work fine for if I was doing a very simple constant environment, and it was always the same ground. So I went and I looked around, and it turns out this is the widely accepted method to do it, but I didn't care for it. It just wasn't working for me. So I thought back to what we did in Xube, and if you remember what we did in Xube for detecting if there was like a wall or something to stop the character from being able to roll in that same direction continuously at the edge of a level, what we did was we had colliders all around the cube. There was 4 colliders, so there's one in each direction on the cube, and if the collider was hit by something, it would say, you can't move in this direction, because there's something there. So I went and I did a fairly similar thing with my character group. So I have, just underneath him, a ground check. And what the ground check does is, I'll pull up the script, it accesses the static variable of platform controller. So it's the static variable of the script, and the static variable is grounded. Where is it? So the static variable is grounded right here, and automatically equals false. And if it equals false, it can't jump. If it equals true, it can. So in ground check, if the trigger that is assigned to the ground check enters a collider, and that collider is tagged either ground or obstacle, then it's true, it's grounded. Once it leaves that trigger, it equals false again, and if it stays in that trigger, it equals true. So this is a little bit faster than what I was doing before, because this is just a trigger. It's not having to constantly update. So not that I was running into any speed issues with this, but I don't want to go to the point where I'm rebuilding something over and over and over again. So I'm trying to build it as fast as I possibly can. So the coconuts, I believe, are tagged as ground as well, or obstacle, and the ice is tagged as obstacle. And this floating panel here is tagged as obstacle. And so is that crate. So basically I just have a big blanket tag that I'll attach to anything that might have the character on top of it, and that counts as obstacle. And if that's the case, then you can jump. And then on the wall, I have on the top of it, let me just get up here. I have on the top of it, no friction. It's a frictionless material because I figured moss might be a little bit slippery, right? But also ground. But on the sides, it's not. So if I'm on top of it, I can jump. If I'm on the sides, well, I can't because there's a cube there, but I can't do it once I'm off the cube. Yeah, I think that's about it. Let's see what else. Oh, Death Zone. So essentially, I just built. Oh, actually, there's 2 more things. So essentially, I just built. Inside of Xube, we had a Death Zone. It was just a big cube underneath everything. If you fell and you made contact with the cube, it would restart the level. What I have it doing here is it will reset the character instead of restarting the level. Restarting the level's fine, but that adds its load time. When you die, it reloads the level. So essentially, it's stupid. It's strong, but it's stupid. So it reloads the level and it's slow. So this guy has his collider on him, and he's tagged player. If player comes into contact with the Death Zone collider, it'll reset the player transform. And on this, there's a script called Death Zone. And all it does, wrong Visual Studio. And all it does is it will take the player transform, and it will reset it to his start position. And this is just a variable that I made that I load in as soon as the level starts. It sets its start position. So if I move the character in the scene manager, it'll change the start position when I start the game. So just if player tag equals player, then it'll reset the start position. And I had to include that little tagline, the check the player tag, because if you pushed ice here, and it wasn't checking the tag, it would reset you, which I can't get on the edge of it right now. But trust me, if you push ice, if you pushed the ice off the edge, which you could, it would reset the player. Or what would also happen was, instead of having it as a trigger, I had it as a collider, so it was just an on collision detection, and that was fine. It would still work the exact same for the player, but since it didn't care that these were hitting it because they weren't tagged player, they would sort of float along it. So if you knocked these off the edge, you could then jump with the character onto these and essentially skid across it. So if you wanted to go from here in the scene manager, here in the game, over to here without actually going through the level, you could just knock a block of ice onto the bottom and surf across the bottom of the level. And that's fine, but kind of defeats the purpose of the game. And then the other thing that I was messing with is fields. So in RealFlow and in Maya, you have particle fields to sort of affect what you got coming through them. I have something very similar in Unity, and I used it as a ceiling. And essentially what it is it's a 2D field. If I go into the 3D view, you can see it's just a 2D field here. And what it does is it applies force at a 90-degree angle, but it applies -10 force. So if the cube comes up this high, pushes it back down. So it's not like a solid wall, but it applies force downward faster than this guy's going to be going up. And realistically, I could set the angle to -90 and the magnitude to 10, and that would still be fine. And then I have a second one of those over here. When the character is supposed to be a little bit higher, he has a little bit more range of movement. And then if I decide to go forward with that, I'll probably all the way along. Oh, and Catherine nicknamed this guy when she saw that I was working on Gus. And her idea was the coconuts. And this thing right here is not just some random stick. It's supposed to be the base of a palm tree. I just haven't made the top yet because I haven't had Photoshop installed on my laptop for very long. So I might get to that at some point. So this is just sort of a Unity basic, so I can't do some of the stuff that you have in Unity Pro. And it's what I can work on between classes and when I'm on lunch at work. So let me know what you think. All right.